Protests in African nations over food, prices and pay have more than doubled in the last 5 years. This is the subtitle of an analysis by the continent's Lydia Namubiru, captioned in bold prints, "Broke, Hungry and Angry." Now, according to the paper, at least 12 other African governments have come under increased citizen pressure in recent years because of the cost of living crisis. In Kenya, these protests doubled in 2020 from what had been in the 2 years prior. Authorities in South Africa, Tunisia, Nigeria, DR Congo, Algeria, Sudan and Uganda have come under similar pressure. Its review of nearly 59,000 reports on protests in Africa collated by the Armed Conflict Location and Data Project between January 2016 to May 2024 tagged and isolated 7,164 protests whose description indicated that they were driven by food, pay, just say wages and salaries, and price concerns. While most of these protests were peaceful, like sittings called by trade unions, 13% escalated into riots, with protesters blocking roads, burning tires, looting food from government warehouse, or attacking food and produce middlemen. Without question, the publication is an apt spotlight on the situation as it is. In Nigeria, negotiations on minimum wage seems to have stalled yet again. Can Africa ever get rid of the toga, broke, hungry and angry? What are the issues driving this protest in Africa? And most importantly, can we tackle them? Our guest on the second half of One Slot is Basil Abia, co-founder of Veriv Africa Abuja. I hope I got that right. Thank you so much, Basil, for giving us your time.
Thank you so much, Felicity. I really appreciate it. It's always a pleasure to be on News Central.
Now, what are the specific factors, in your view, that are driving the increase in protests across African nations, and how are they interconnected?
Well, I mean, like the report said, and even if I've not read the report, by the way, but I have to give you, from my own experience as a researcher and a policy analyst, the last 5 years, primarily from the pandemic period, that's 2020, till now in 2024, there's been a steady, in fact, for some countries, there's been a steep rise in cost of living that has, and is still contributing to socioeconomic anxiety. This, of course, spirals into demonstrations and protests in the spaces, regardless of whether these particular countries are either democratic or undemocratic in that sense. So you would see that there's a distribution of these protests, these mass demonstrations, some form of political activism and the civic space being much more active than necessary. And this spread across both the democratic countries, apologies for that, both the democratic African countries, but also the undemocratic African countries. So yeah, first reason, of course, I would say is the inflationary environment in most African countries is driving costs up, is making living really untenable for a lot of people. It's even reversing either to rural to urban migration. So we're seeing a reverse migration now happening with people moving back to the rural areas because for them, they're not food secure. And you know how harsh these realities are in urban areas across Africa. They think that they would have access to land, and with that, regardless of the very stringent land laws, we all know how easy or how easier it is when compared to urban areas for someone to rent a farmland and get to farm. So even if it's a one-off season type of farming you're doing, you're rest assured that you have a number of tubers, a number of bags that can secure you and your family, and you think that that is much better than staying in the urban areas, mostly in the outskirts of the urban areas where you cannot even afford living there to endure. So we're seeing a reversal of that rural urban migration numbers, and then we're seeing the inflationary surge make life untenable for a lot of Africans, especially young Africans. We have to put the statistics out there. 70% of 70% of Africans are below the age of 40. So we're a very young continent, and there's a lot of anxiety with regards employment. How readily can the economy or the economies in Africa provide jobs? As I speak with you, there are only 3 million job openings every year in the African continent for 12 million job applicants who on the continent who are surging up year on year on. And that, don't forget, that number is increasing because most African countries have higher fertility rates. Niger's fertility rate is around 5. I know that Nigeria's fertility rate hovers between 3 to 4. And let's look at the inflation numbers. What are the inflation numbers across board? In Egypt, inflation is about 28.1%. And we all know that they have a teetered experience with civic participation. We all know that the Arab Spring was very pivotal in changing the landscape, the political and socio-economic landscape of Egypt. And in fact, that's a major reason why sometimes you notice a lot more investments from other Middle East countries are flushing, getting into Egypt. Because again, from a geopolitical risk perspective, most of these Arab governments think that the first place for another trigger, another anti-monarchical trigger, might come from Cairo. So you have to be able to do anything possible to make sure that the regime in Cairo is secure. Right. And one way to do that is to flush them with funding. So you flush them with funding, infrastructure can happen.
You've highlighted quite a number of issues, but I'd like to pick on something you said, just for verification purposes. Nigeria alone has, if we're to continue with the estimation, over 200 million people. And then you're talking about the African continent, and you say, I just wanted clarification, that you have about 2 million job openings per year.
3 million.
3 million? Is that a fair, where is this data coming from? Because that would be scary. We talk about creating employment every day. Governments across the continent, they campaign on the premise that they're going to create more job opportunities. And you say that data is showing just about 3 million. Let's even put it at 5 million. Nigeria has 200 million population. I need you to break that down for us.
Formal job openings. Let me at formal job openings, because again, the highest employers on the African continent actually comes from the informal economy. But
okay, because
2 to 3 million. This data is obviously, the data is from the African Development Bank, and a number of researchers who have also been using the numbers. I was at a panel on the Chinese CTGN, so Chinese-based television on Africa, basically. And this program was the panel was in Nairobi, but obviously virtually I attended. And I had a cross examination, and questions were being pelted at me by university students from Nairobi. And the same problem everywhere across the continent. There are no sufficient jobs for
it is scary to even fathom that for Nigeria alone, for instance, you have only this amount of, let's assume we have that for Nigeria, it still doesn't, cut it at all if we have to meet any targets of producing a better economic situation for all of us. How has economic policies and decisions, in your view, contributed to the rise in food prices and cost of living? And then we talk about, on the one hand, we're talking about whether formal or however you look at it, job openings. We also talk about wage stagnation.
Yeah, so economic policies like closing the land border for Africa's largest economy for close to 3 years, it's ridiculous. And this has obviously spiraled. There's a direct connection. I mean, if you look at the charts, and I do this a lot whenever I get the chance, I'll show you a chart of our inflation rate before we close the borders. And then you see there's a steep rise right after the land border closure starts. That's largely because you don't have enough domestic supply to meet our large domestic demand. And so when you're closing the borders and you're making it illegal to import the food supplies that you need to be able to meet the local demand, what you're doing is you're creating another artificial scarcity. And we all know what happens when there's artificial scarcity. That leads to an increase in price, and cost price increase basically gives into the inflationary pressures. And when you have inflationary pressures, you have to be able to start having conversations about wage increase, because again, the workers simply cannot afford to buy food. And then the folks in the informal economy are struggling, and they start to demonstrate. We start to see this spiral into protests. I know that, of course, the NSAS protests were largely against, I would say, jurisdictional overheating, mostly by the SARS group themselves in that sense. And this obviously spiraled to a reaction after SARS operatives killed a number of youths, if I'm not mistaken, in the Niger Delta. I don't know the specific town where this happened. But then we all know that the protests just spiraled. And now a major reason why the protests were that widespread was first and foremost the youths. Nigerian youths were fed up with the entire system. Yes, they were fed up with the excesses of the SARS unit, but let me not lie to you, because I was an active participant. I was in the forefront. In fact, the popular NSAS photo of Aisha Yesufu, if you see a light-skinned guy with a face mask, that person is me. I was in the photos. I was there on the field, so I'm going to give you fact for a fact. A large cause of people coming out in their numbers during the NSAS protest was the socioeconomic anxiety, the lack of jobs, the very poor income, or the lack of income, and then, of course, the rising cost of goods and services. And this was in 2020. So now imagine right now, with the headline inflation increasing by 17 percentage points since 2020 to now. Inflation right now, the headline inflation right now in Nigeria is about 33.69%. Inflation is about 40.8%. Look, my dear friends, my dear listeners, socioeconomic anxiety is leading to this. And the major reason, of course, is some of our very restrictive protectionist economic policies. There are other policies as well. For instance, the ways and means financing of the CBN to the economy, to funding the government, obviously leads to a deficit. And that deficit leads to a hole and makes the naira weaker. We all know that. You're flooding the money supply rate at uncontrollable levels. And what in classical economy, what that means basically is
because I mean, you have been able to highlight definitely to show us that you believe there is a correlation between what we are experiencing now and some of these policies. It takes me back to another question now, to something you raised. You talked about reverse migration. What role has climate change and environmental degradation played in impacting food security and livelihoods in Africa? I mean, you could continue to contextualize it with the Nigerian scenario, because Nigeria is indeed in Africa.
Yeah, so aside from Nigeria as well, I can contextualize it with Malawi, that is currently undergoing some of the worst famine and drought in their history. This has led to a surge in food prices, that has led to an artificial scarcity in the macroeconomy of Malawi. That's the same situation. In fact, Zambia are going through even far worse because it's affecting their energy systems. But yes, the fact is there, the data is there, there's peer-reviewed research. I have come across them and I keep coming across them. In fact, we're setting up a research and advisory center on the environment and green transition in our company called Very Africa, to be able to study even in depth the impact of climate change on a number of these things. And we can see that the data is telling us that the continuous environmental degradation of our land surface systems, of our farmlands, the continued drying of our water bodies, especially of our rivers, they continue overflooding, because obviously, again, climate change also means that we see extremities in weather patterns, right? So when you have rain, you have too much rainfall. When you have too much rainfall, what do you have? Mass flooding. So the mass flooding is making our food systems vulnerable. We saw that during the mass floods of 2022, when rice farms were awash. The biggest rice farm in the country cost about $10 million to put together. Went off. All of the produce went off. That caused a significant spike in local rice prices. That's the case in Egypt. We're seeing that, of course, in Mali. We're seeing that in Guinea. We're seeing that in Gabon. We're seeing that in northern Ghana and Burkina Faso. Climate change, the extremities of the weather patterns are making food systems very vulnerable. These food systems obviously lead to increased food prices. So the bulk of our inflation is actually cost push. And it's cost push because, again, if you look at the data, across sub-Saharan Africa, 50 to 60% of the income is spent every month on food. That is the across the board average. So if 50 to 60% of the average income in sub-Saharan Africa is spent on food, and food prices are constantly being on the rise, largely because our food systems are vulnerable to extreme weather patterns, in this case, climate change, you can see a direct correlation between climate change and the extreme weather patterns, and of course the socioeconomic anxiety that Africans are going through. And this is also pipelining into the mass protests, the rise of mass protests or cost of living. So there are lots of dynamic into this. Poor economic policies, climate change, but also let's not forget climate change is also driving conflict. We're seeing that where farmers and herders are now competing for land and water bodies, that is leading to armed violent conflict. And it's not only happening in Nigeria, we're seeing that farmer and violent herder conflict now happen in Mali. It's also happening in some isolated parts of northern Ghana as well. In this sense. So, and we have noticed that also this has been the trend in Kenya, even though the the herders, the Maasai, are not really herders in that sense.
All right. When we continue to highlight...
It's conflict between the farmers and the Maasai herders too.
All right. I hate to interrupt you, but I just felt that we should also take a look at the issues are numerous, but can you evaluate the various government responses to the impact of climate change and how it is pushing some of the conflicts you mentioned, herders, farmers, and then the reverse migration for people in the rural coming to the urban areas? What actions are you seeing? Just evaluate it, and maybe if you can, talk to us about what strategies they could begin to employ to help a little to address some of these climate-induced changes.
I think we've seen significant policy activity when it comes to prescriptions towards this crisis. We have seen, we're currently enduring through close to 12 months of massive macroeconomic reforms carried out by President Bola Ahmed Tinubu, just to be able to arrest inflationary trends right now, the cost of living crisis in Nigeria. We're seeing the same reform activity, policy reform activity. A similar one happened in Ghana. We're seeing Egypt ramp up a number of incentives to increase food production as well and to make sure that they're food secure. We're seeing that happen to some extent in South Africa, to some extent in Ethiopia amidst the violent conflict that is happening there. And Kenya. But I think, again, and this is my concern with the policy environment in Africa, we're taking a textbook American or Western approach to some of the responses, some of the policy responses to the crisis. So, for instance, we're seeing increased activity in terms of increasing interest rates as a way to curtail or fight inflation. I do not think that has yielded the key results that you want to expect, especially in Nigeria. I do not think that increasing interest rates is also helping with the situation in East Africa, particularly in Kenya. Although Kenya has a more tenable inflation rate around 5%, which is, to be honest, as a Nigerian, I'll beg for that right now. But just to come to the point, the textbook approach, the Western classic economist approach to policy prescriptions to solving these problems isn't helping. What can help right now is to look at supply side economics. Because again, like I said, the core of the inflationary surge across sub-Saharan Africa is cost push, basically a reduction in production due to high cost of production. And that reduction in production ensures that prices continue to stay high and makes life really tough. Now, there's also statistics and peer-reviewed research by IMF economists. By the way, these IMF economists used to push for interest rate hikes. But a peer-reviewed paper came out, research paper came out just last month by a number of IMF economists saying that since 2020, so basically since the pandemic, the bulk of inflation in advanced economies and in emerging economies, particularly, of course, in sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, so what researchers refer to as global south, the bulk of the inflation in both the advanced economies and the emerging economies is actually cost push. It's not a macroeconomic condition issue. It's not a money supply issue. It's a cost push issue, which means that we're having global supply side constraints, global supply chain and value chain constraints, high cost of energy, which obviously yields to cost of production. For context, in Nigeria, according to the Manufacturing Association of Nigeria, 40% of cost of production increase in the last 2 years, 40% in 2022 and 40% again in 2023, came all from a high cost of diesel, because of course 90% of these manufacturers depend on diesel-powered generators for their electricity. Self-generation is about 40,000 megawatts on average. Self-generation mostly by diesel-powered plants, and then we've started to see some coal-powered plants for our cement factories. We've started to see some hybrid, some solar. 7-Up have now switched to a hybrid situation. I think they're currently consuming about 3 megawatts of electricity across all of their factories in Nigeria using solar. So we are starting to see some off-grid solar solutions, but most of the energy that our manufacturers, not only in Nigeria, but across sub-Saharan Africa, is actually very costly and actually is from off the grid. So we have energy situations, energy constraints that are leading to high cost of production across sub-Saharan Africa. And this, of course, has led us to the situation that we're in.
A lot to chew on. I just wanted you to, exhaustively speak on that. I would also love to take on a part where you talked about us implementing the textbook American or Western approach to policy making. But in the interest of time, I'd like us to just try and cover as much as broad of an area as we can. How, in your view, has government responses to protests and the expression of grievances and concerns over food has affected the situation as we have it today and making us continue to see more protests?
Government response has been in bad faith for most parts of the continent. We saw that with Ghana towards the protest last year, particularly the cost of living protest last year. And that has continued into the year, the new year. That obviously has been the case with Nigeria ever since the NSAS protest. Take, for instance, of course, the current minimum wage negotiations between organized labor and the federal government of Nigeria. I think that the negotiations have been in bad faith, they've not been sincere, and there's been a lot of policy incoherence. Policy and government officials knew that there was a necessity for wage increase as the first month since the new administration took over office last year, because obviously they carried out this record-breaking macroeconomic policy reforms. For the first time in 50 years, we no longer had, technically we no longer had energy subsidies, particularly PMS subsidies, or what we refer to as fuel subsidies. And so that—
I like when you do that quote thing.
Yeah, that increased pricing, average PMS pricing from about 180 naira per liter to over 600. In fact, there's some parts of Nigeria right now, particularly in my hometown, Yola, where people are buying a liter at over 1,000 naira, or even more, from official fuel pump stations in that sense. So with all of this steep increase, with this price transmission due to the response, or the shock response due to the policy reforms, it was a necessity to push for wage increase or wage reforms. And I remember being at the forefront of this on social media saying a minimum wage increase is very necessary, because at the end of the day—
Okay, so I'm looking to get a response as to government's handling of the situation so far, their responses to these protests and concerns being expressed, as well as the wage issue. How can they respond better? That was where I was going to, because it is a fact that we have a situation.
Sure, of course. I was given commentary as to the very poor response, the bad faith negotiations. But then how can government respond better? Obviously, use data. That is literally the truth. I don't think we deploy data when we do our scenario analysis. I don't think we deploy data when we're doing our policy prescriptions. If you're doing a minimum wage negotiation and you're trying to put out the policy, which I am very sure, as you're aware, that Wale Edun, the coordinating minister of the economy in Nigeria, has already sent out a template, submitted a template to his boss, the president. And now I'm hoping that there's some form of data infusion to the prescription, because you have to account for inflation. What has been the rate of devaluation of the naira ever since the last minimum wage was agreed upon in 2019? What has been the rate of increase when it comes to inflation? Then you are able to now quantify that number in your new minimum wage negotiation with organized labor. So that even if organized labor come up with an absurd number like 450,000 naira or 300,000 naira per month for their minimum wage demand, you can say, according to data, this has been the rate of increase. So if we increase minimum wage at this particular amount, we're going to equalize the loss of value that a 33,000 naira per month used to give. So if the data and the econometric regression that has been carried out using inflation data and using the rate of reduction in the value of the naira, obviously by looking at the devaluation rate, what the cost of the naira is, what the cost of the dollar is against the naira, that regression will definitely give you an exact number. And I think off the top of my head, that number should be right around 120,000 or 125,000 naira, because we've done some experiments. So if you're coming up at 120,000 or more, I would say that's a reasonable way to negotiate the wage increase. But a 62,000 naira is in bad faith and doesn't deploy data. And obviously, organized labor aren't done.
Let me interject here, because as the conversation continues over the minimum wage and what is a reasonable amount, there are experts like yourself that argue that if there is over 100% a rise in wages, it will impact negatively on the inflation and the economy because there will be more money and less things to buy, if I get that right. So when you say that's a reasonable amount to put forward, what about the other implications that seem to concern experts like yourself? Don't you share their concerns?
Oh, well, if you heard me clearly, I said Nigeria's and Sub-Saharan Africa's inflationary environment is dominated by cost price or cost push. And this is obviously with the reduction in production capacity. That ensures the supply cannot meet existing demand. So yes, categorically, there's going to be a policy transmission lag with a minimum wage increase. But we have to understand that this is the case in almost every macroeconomic environment around the world. Whenever there is a minimum wage increase, there's a transitory or transitionary period of inflation. I think, and not that I think, there's enough peer-reviewed econometrics papers conducted by Nigerian economists carrying out, an analysis of the macroeconomic environment when it relates to inflation. And they highlight that some of this transitioning period can take, at the very least, 6 months. So this is why I say for policymakers, they have to be able to deploy data and some of these analyses. Now, if you're deploying data and increasing minimum wage, you have to ensure that your fiscal side or your fiscal policy prescriptions are just as good. So you have to prepare for that 6 months to 9 months transitory period of that inflation led by increasing minimum wage. You also have to make sure that, first and foremost, you find policy prescriptions that enable for more food supply. And in the interim, because Nigeria cannot meet the domestic demand for food, with all things being equal, in the next 2 years, for the next 2 years, to equate and equalize that transitory inflation period of 6 to 9 months, ensure that there's an influx of food imports. And I know that there have been rumors, I've even read the document, according to a purported executive order on inflation control by the federal government, mostly obviously that came from Wale Edun's office towards the president, but obviously it's going to be the president's presidential executive order if that actually happens. They plan to freeze restrictions on importation of basic... But
I'm enjoying this conversation so much. I really hate to interrupt you, but we have run out of time, unfortunately. So I'll just say thank you very much for some of the comments you've given us tonight. And we hope that we have people listening, honestly, to some of this submission and to evaluate where we are at. Thank you for speaking with us.
It is always a pleasure to be on the show and to be on News Central. Felicity, thank you so much.
I do have some thoughts today. In February, while Nigeria was already marching to protest the high cost of living, the African Development Bank issued a warning that the rising cost of energy, food and other commodities in several African countries, including Angola, Ethiopia and Kenya, could trigger social unrest. We're living that reality now. Because I live in Nigeria and daily experience the growing frustrations, I'm compelled to remind us how dangerous the precipice is. Never in the history of this country have citizens engaged in protest over shortage of food or increase in prices of food items until this year. This country is truly on the edge. I say this because history tells us that major crises have their roots as expressions of frustrations triggered by the search for food and the lack thereof. So beyond the eloquent speeches by government is the need for tangible actions, one that gives real hope. I do believe we know what needs to be done. We have experts like Basil and others who could come together and make some helpful submission. Our failure is a weak will on both sides, the government and her people. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.